Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty complex topic, the anthropology of gender. We're going to unpack its deep connections to culture, to power, and even to our own well-being. Our journey today, well, is built on a whole range of sources. We've got academic research, systematic reviews, and even, those lively online discussions. So it's a really multifaceted look at how gender roles get shaped, how they're performed, and importantly, how they're challenged across different societies.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, our mission today is pretty clear. We want to systematically kind of unravel the history and the cultural forces that have defined gender. We want to shed light on how these definitions actually impact individuals, like in real ways, and then explore the amazing efforts going on to build a more inclusive, more equitable world. Understanding this stuff, it's not just academic, it's really crucial for navigating your own experiences and, well, the whole world around you.
Okay, let's unpack this then. How does culture start sculpting our idea of gender, like right from the very beginning?
Oh, it's profound, isn't it? From such a young age, culture just massively influences everything about gender behavior, beliefs, identities, roles, how we perceive things. Kids get socialized super early. They're often given specific chores, taught what's culturally right for their gender. And this leads pretty quickly to forming really strong gender
Yeah.
stereotypes.
So it's baked in really, really early on. Cross-cultural research even suggests kids are categorizing gender by, what, age 2 or 3?
That's right.
And by 4 or 5, they're often like deeply set in these culturally approved roles. Given how deep that runs, what happens? What are the consequences when someone doesn't fit into those expectations?
Yeah, the consequences can be genuinely negative. We're talking about ridicule, maybe bullying, feeling marginalized, or even outright rejection by their peers. And it's so important to grasp that these roles, they aren't fixed or natural. They're mostly learned, through communication, socialization, within families, schools, the media we consume. They're socially constructed, and they change quite a bit across different cultures and different times in history.
So if they're learned, how do we actually see that happening? How are these roles communicated day to day? Can you give us some concrete example?
Sure, absolutely. Think about language, for instance. You often observe men using more assertive language, direct eye contact, maybe more expansive gestures, while women tend towards more indirect language, relying more on facial expressions, body posture. Then there are these sort of permissions and prohibitions based on gender, like men often having more freedom to just walk around alone at night, whereas women are generally expected to follow stricter norms, often tied to safety or, decorum.
Right.
And this can create double standards in communication itself. Boys might be encouraged to speak up in class,
Yeah.
while girls are taught more to listen carefully, avoid interrupting.
All these examples of learned roles,
Mm-hmm.
it really brings us back to the basics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do we then draw that line between sex and gender? For our listeners, we know this isn't the same thing, but let's just underline why that distinction is so vital here.
It's absolutely crucial because sex, well, that refers to the biological or genetic stuff, often seen as permanent. But gender is a social construct. It's fluid. It changes over time, varies across cultures. It's actually produced and reproduced by society. And even like a big organizations, companies, they play a huge role in shaping and reinforcing what gender means. It's not some fixed essence.
Okay, got it. So let's zoom out a bit then. When we look at gender relations historically, this word patriarchy just keeps coming up. It feels so persistent. How did this system get so dominant in so many places, and how do we still see it playing out today?
It's really interesting because, well, we usually define patriarchy as, the ruling power of men or male leaders within a group, like a family or society where men are often the elders. And historically, yeah, it was widespread. Think ancient Greece, Rome, China, women were clearly subordinate. But what's really striking is how adaptable it is. If you look back at, say, hunter-gatherer nomadic groups, women often had more bargaining power. Why? Because they could literally just leave if things weren't working out.
That's a powerful thought. The ability to walk away gave leverage.
Yeah.
Okay, so what changed? What shifted that balance so dramatically?
Exactly. Well, with the rise of settled farming societies, people got tied to the land. You couldn't just pick up and go.
Yeah.
And then you see the emergence of war bands, often male-dominated, becoming the core of the community. This frequently led to women having to settle with husbands, losing that crucial bargaining chip they might have had before. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about changing economics that fundamentally rewrote the rules.
And you mentioned biological influences, too. That comes up a lot. How much did things like pregnancy really play into this historical division of labor and ultimately male dominance?
Historically, yes. Pregnancy certainly put women at a disadvantage for things like hunting big game or defense. So men tended to take on those roles, which contributed to what some call a monopoly of violence and eventually leadership positions. This initial division then got kind of inherited and adapted as societies got more complex. Plus, the historical uncertainty around paternity. That often led societies to put stricter rules around women's sexual purity to ensure lineage and inheritance. So it's this really complex mix of social, economic, and, yeah, even biological factors building up the system over time.
Right. So what theoretical tools can help us make sense of patriarchy's really deep structure and its varied impacts?
There are several key feminist theories that offer different lenses. Radical feminist analysis, for one, they tend to view patriarchy as the main social division, seeing the family unit as really central to maintaining men's supremacy. Some within that school even link its roots back to biological differences, like women's role in reproduction.
Okay, so that's one angle.
Then you have the Marxist feminist perspective. They argue that patriarchy really grew out of capitalism. The idea is that capitalism benefits from women's unpaid work in the home, directly linking gender inequality to class inequality. And then there's dual system theory, which sort of combines both. It sees capitalism and patriarchy as like separate but mutually reinforcing systems. Both systems structure things in a way that benefits from women's roles, keeping them subjugated.
That's a helpful breakdown of the main theories. And didn't the sociologist Sylvia Walby offer a more kind of practical framework too?
She did, yeah. Walby talks about 6 key structures of patriarchy: household production, paid work, the state itself, male violence, sexuality, and culture. And what she really highlights is this big historical shift. We moved from private patriarchy, where women were mostly stuck in the home, limited public life,
Right.
to public patriarchy. That's where women entered the public sphere, got jobs, but still faced and face widespread inequality and discrimination in paid work. And this shift, well, it was largely pushed by feminist movements fighting for basic rights, voting, education, earning property.
We've talked about how deep some of these norms run, but the hopeful part is they aren't set in stone, are they? It really feels like there's a shift happening in how masculinity is understood, how it's performed. What exactly is changing there?
Masculinity is definitely not fixed. It's a dynamic social construct, always evolving with society and culture. Traditionally, orthodox masculinity pushed dominance, strength, keeping emotions bottled up stoicism. And this traditional ideal, well, it's been linked to worse health outcomes for men, like being reluctant to go to the doctor. And also to perpetuating negative social behaviors, think sexual objectification of women, homophobia, often used to kind of prop up a man's perceived straightness and power.
So a direct link between those rigid norms and actual harm. But how are these new masculinities challenging those old restrictive ideas?
They're challenging them pretty directly, actually. We're seeing a couple of key frameworks emerge. One is hybrid masculinities. This is where you see straight men, often those with privilege, adopting bits of culture usually associated with marginalized masculinities. It allows them to show sensitivity, emotion, but maybe still keep that image of toughness.
Interesting. Sort of mixing and matching.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's inclusive masculinity theory. This is characterized by straight men actively rejecting homophobia. They're including gay friends in their social circles, engaging emotionally and even physically with other men in non-sexual ways. Things like, cuddling, spooning, even kissing, especially with close friends or maybe in sports contexts or sometimes when drinking. And often doing this quite openly without fear of being judged.
That is quite a shift. And what's really interesting is how men themselves describe these changes. What are the core elements they identify?
Yeah, research looking into how men perceive this has identified 4 key things. First, inclusivity. This shows up as less homophobia, rejecting misogyny, and just a general desire for more gender equality. You might see it, for example, in men joining gay sports clubs, though sometimes they might still subtly signal their own heterosexuality.
Okay, inclusivity. What else?
Second, emotional intimacy. This is a big one. It's the willingness for men to share deep feelings, show emotions with their male friends. directly challenges that old stoicism, right?
Really?
It includes showing support, being vulnerable about things like body image, openly displaying affection. And when you look at studies on fatherhood, this comes through as prioritizing close relationships with kids and family.
So it's not just about not doing the old toxic stuff, but actively embracing connection.
Exactly. Third is physicality. There's an increase in intentional, non-sexual touch between men. You see it a lot in sports and schools, maybe. Things like full-on hugs, sharing beds sometimes, touching faces, kissing, often done openly, authentically. And finally, resistance. A clear rejection of that old-school, orthodox masculinity and its norms. This includes actively avoiding violence, questioning rigid gender roles, even in things like, say, cheerleading.
These changes sound really positive. So for you listening, what does this evolution of masculinities actually mean for individuals, for society? What are the tangible upsides?
Oh, the benefits are real, not just theoretical. For men themselves, having this freedom to express emotions, to be vulnerable, that's huge for mental health and well-being. And for society as a whole, more acceptance of diverse genders and sexualities helps lower violence levels, fosters better relationships all around. Ultimately, it also helps chip away at those unequal power dynamics between men and women, moving us towards a more gender-equal society.
Speaking of equality, feminism has obviously been central to these conversations for, well, centuries. What were its core aims initially, and how have those goals shifted over time?
Right. Feminism at its core is about establishing equal rights for men and women politically, morally, and creating ways for women's concerns to be heard. Its history stretches way back. You've got 18th century figures like Olympe de Gouges in France, publishing a Declaration of Rights for Women in 1791. Mary Wollstonecraft in England, her 1792 Vindication of the Rights of Women, arguing women seemed lesser only because they lacked education and were confined to domestic roles. In America, the movement really grew out of the anti-slavery movement in the 1830s. Leaders like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, inspired by abolitionism, organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, demanding the vote, demanding independence. And of course, the suffragettes in Britain fighting for universal suffrage. They got the vote for some women over 30 in 1918, and then all adults over 21 in 1928.
But it seems like within feminism itself, there have been different ideas about what equality really means. Let's unpack that sameness versus difference debate. That feels like a core tension.
It absolutely is, and it's been a long-running dispute. On one side, you have the sameness argument. This was often championed by early individual feminists, some second-wave feminists too. It basically advocates for equal treatment under the law. The idea is that women have the same cognitive abilities as men, so they should be integrated into existing, often male-designed structures. Some argued for, like, strict equality in work and home life, even questioning things like women being exempt from military combat, seeing it as a kind of special treatment.
Okay, so the goal there is assimilation, essentially. Treat us exactly the same because we are the same in capability. What's the counter-argument? The difference side.
Right, so the difference argument takes a different tack. Cultural feminists, for instance, really valued roles like mothering. They saw it as evidence of women having an inherent nature geared towards nurturing, towards peace. Theorists like Luce Irigaray or Carol Gilligan stressed the importance of acknowledging and valuing women's distinct ways of understanding, their unique bodily experiences, their ethics. Some, like Sarah Reddick, even proposed that maybe reducing gender inequality requires centering and valuing traditionally feminine qualities, actually replacing masculine values.
That sounds like a really tricky balance to strike. How do you push for equality without either erasing important differences or, on the flip side, reinforcing old stereotypes? How do more recent thinkers handle this?
Well, Anne Phillips offered a really insightful perspective. She pointed out that demanding sameness often just meant women were treated as if they were men, ignoring specific needs. But demanding recognition for specific needs could sometimes imply women needed compensation for being somehow lesser.
Yeah, I see the trap there.
So Phillips advocated for embracing a plurality of many differences. The idea is that equality can exist alongside diversity. We don't have to force everyone into the exact same mold. Iris Marion Young built on this, arguing we need to rethink equality itself so it acknowledges and values group differences, rather than trying to pretend they don't exist or neutralize them.
Okay.
And this connects, in a way, to Judith Butler's hugely influential idea of gender as performativity. It's not just about acting a gender role. It's this deeper idea that categories like man or woman aren't fixed identities inside us. They're more like patterns of behavior, language, social expectations that get repeated over and over, creating the effect of a stable identity.
Right.
Recognizing this performance, which isn't like theater, it's deeply ingrained, opens up space for, as Butler put it, free play with gender, challenging rigid norms like compulsory heterosexuality.
That's a really powerful way to think about identity itself.
All right.
Okay, bring this back to the ground. What are the actual real-world consequences of sticking too rigidly to these gender norms, especially for young adults' mental health?
Yeah, this is where it gets really serious. How do these cultural expectations directly hit our psychological well-being? Well, research pretty consistently shows a significant positive link between conforming to traditional feminine norms and psychological distress in females.
Really? How so?
Basically, societal pressures around appearance, modesty, being nurturing, thinness, focusing on relationships, all these increase women's vulnerability to anxiety, body image issues, eating disorders, and this often gets amplified by the kind of patriarchal ideals pushed through social media.
Okay. And what about for males? Is there a similar straight line between conforming to traditional masculinity and mental health problems?
It seems. Well, a bit more complex for males. Some studies do link traditional masculine norms, things like emotional control, dominance, avoiding vulnerability to psychological distress, depressive symptoms in adolescent boys, and this can lead to them being less likely to seek help, potentially increasing suicide risk. However, other research, particularly some studies from India, for example, didn't find a significant overall link between conforming to masculine norms and distress. So it suggests a more nuanced picture. The impact might depend on which specific norms we're talking about and the cultural context. Like maybe adhering to primacy of work doesn't correlate with distress in one context, but rigidly sticking to self-reliance does.
So given these mental health connections, how early do these rigid gender expectations really take root? Is it mainly happening within the family?
Oh, absolutely. Gender socialization kicks off really early, right in the household. Kids quickly internalize behaviors that often equate being masculine with having power and being feminine with being more subservient. And any deviation from these roles, even something that seems small, like a boy preferring girl toys, can lead to being corrected or chastised. This just reinforces sticking to those rigid standards and can deepen psychological distress down the line. Research clearly shows that gender-based discrimination, violence, things like early marriage, social restrictions, they're all directly tied to mental distress. This is especially true for adolescent girls in many low and middle income countries, like India. It contributes to that known gender split and depression rates that emerges around age 16.
Wow.
And furthermore, holding patriarchal beliefs itself is consistently linked to higher rates of depression in both men and women. So all this just screams for the urgent need for gender-sensitive mental health approaches. Interventions that actively challenge harmful stereotypes, promote well-being for everyone. The goal has to be dismantling these rigid norms to build more resilience, more equity.
It's truly disturbing how these ingrained norms can then escalate into actual discrimination, even violence. How do societies typically deal with these issues? Or perhaps fail to deal with them adequately?
Well, discrimination, legally, it's defined as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on gender, which has the purpose or effect of restricting human rights. And, importantly, it should never be justified by pointing to biological or cultural differences. Real discrimination, unequal pay, harassment, systemic barriers, that's a fundamental violation of basic human rights, of free will.
So discrimination is a rights violation, plain and simple. And violence, too, seems so often to have a gender dimension.
It really does. While violence broadly is any behavior which harms others physically or emotionally, from murder and rape right down to sexualized verbal abuse, it disproportionately targets women. Men's harmful behaviors, rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, these are identified as primary ways women are kept subordinate. And there's this really troubling tendency in society to minimize women's experiences of violence. You hear dismissive things like, oh, nothing actually happened, which just invalidates their distress. Men, on the other hand, often use rhetorical tricks to downplay their own abusive actions. And society frequently ends up blaming women for domestic violence or rape. She made him angry, or she was dressed temptingly. This kind of normalization happens precisely because masculinity often holds sway over femininity in our gender relations.
That normalization is just incredibly problematic. But surely, there are efforts underway to push back against this, to create change.
Yes, absolutely. Thankfully, that normalization is increasingly being challenged. by individuals speaking out, by academic researchers, by activist groups, by professionals in the justice system. While that pressure to conform to traditional boosted masculinity is still there, these collective efforts are absolutely vital in fighting back against harmful norms and changing how we see things.
Okay, so this whole deep dive, it's uncovered a lot of really complex challenges. But it also feels like there's real momentum, doesn't it, towards creating a more inclusive world. What are some of the key strategies driving that change? And what can people listening actually do?
Well, one absolutely foundational strategy is education. There's still a significant lack of knowledge about gender-related topics, including things like queer sexual health. This lack of knowledge fuels misinformation, fuels stigma. So tackling that education gap is just crucial for any progress.
Right. Education first. What else?
Another huge one is transforming mainstream representations. Right now, white, cisgender, heterosexual men are often way overrepresented. They're depicted as the default or the norm. This leads to a serious lack of accurate, diverse portrayals of women, of queer individuals, and that reinforces harmful narratives that basically categorize people into normal versus other. So increasing visibility, giving platforms to marginalized voices, maybe through podcasts like this, or initiatives showcasing diverse creators, that's a really vital step.
So we need better education and more diverse stories. What about the ways these norms just get passed down, almost unconsciously?
Yeah, we also have to confront what's called gatekeeping, or sometimes social reproduction. This is the tendency for people to just replicate the social norms they grew up with, often without thinking about it. Confronting this can be uncomfortable, even painful sometimes, but becoming aware of these systemic inequalities is absolutely essential if we want to break those cycles.
Okay, so for you listening right now, beyond just being aware, what are some really concrete things you can do to actually contribute to this change?
There are lots of actionable steps, really. You can inspire, actively seek out, listen to, and share stories and experiences that challenge old norms. Think about supporting platforms like podcasts or blogs that amplify voices of young women, queer individuals. Sharing their work is powerful. You can empower others. Look for ways to support systems designed to help creators and activists. Maybe that's through mentorship, donating, sharing resources, promoting their work, and you can connect. Work to build community across different identities, different places, foster learning and support through events, online groups, local initiatives. Every single voice really is valuable, and even small actions add up to significant change. Support your local queer and feminist businesses. Maybe consider becoming a change maker yourself. Start your own project, however small. Actively follow and share content from relevant social media accounts. Read articles, share them. Donate to organizations doing this critical work if you can. Every bit helps.
Yeah, this conversation really underscores that dismantling these rigid gender binaries, promoting real equality, it needs both solid legal frameworks and a deep shift in how society thinks and feels. It really calls for a nuanced approach, doesn't it? One that respects cultural diversity, but always prioritizes fundamental human rights.
Wow.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at the intricate ways culture shapes gender, examined the long shadow of patriarchy, explored the really exciting evolution of masculinities, and delved into that ongoing global push for equality. We've seen how deeply these norms touch everything, from daily life to mental health, and importantly, we've identified some hopeful paths towards a more inclusive future.
Yeah. And if you reflect on everything we've talked about, maybe here's a final thought to chew on. In a world where we're increasingly seeing gender as performative, where this idea of a plurality of many differences is gaining ground and being valued, what does true freedom of identity actually look like? And how might you individually and how might we collectively embody that freedom more fully in our own lives?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. We really hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights, broadened your perspective, and maybe sparked some new questions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the knowledge that shapes our world.